If I've got Jesus, that's all I'll ever need. We're going to get to that. But I'm going to do something this morning that I've never done here before. In 6 years of being pastor here, I've never once done this. So for those of you that joined last Sunday, I'm sorry, you picked the wrong week. I'm going to do something this Sunday that I've never talked about before, and let's just tell the truth up front here. It's because I'm chicken. I'm scared. I've been scared. Because this Sunday, I'm going to talk about money. In most churches, most liturgical, more traditional churches, those churches that we think of that have been around even longer than we Baptist churches have, the Episcopalians and Catholics, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, they raise up their young, first slide, Mr. Chip, they raise up their young in classes that they refer to as catechism. Perhaps you've heard of catechism. Perhaps you've gone through catechism if you grew up in one of those more liturgical churches. That's great. Part of what catechism does is, like if you take the famous Westminster Catechism, which is on the far right there, the shorter form of that catechism has like 121 questions that Presbyterian boys and girls have to learn all of the correct answers to. The first of those questions is, what is the chief aim of man? Why do we even exist? And the answer is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, if you were to read the Westminster Catechism. These are classes that kids are put through for a year or more. In 1871, this fella, next slide, came up with his own catechism. That's Mark Twain, if you don't know who that is. And in 1871, in September of that year, in the New York Daily Tribune, he posted what he called the Revised Catechism. Maybe you can read it there on the right. And talking about the current state of American society, this is, as only Mark Twain could say, this is what he said: what is the chief aim of man? To get rich. In what way? Dishonestly if we can, honestly if we must. And who is God, the one and only true? His third question in his catechism. Well, Twain says, money is God. Gold and greenbacks and stock. Father, Son, and the ghost of the same. Three persons in one. These are the true and only God, mighty and supreme. And you may see there his last statement, and William Tweed is his prophet. By the way, if you don't know who William Tweed is, you should look that dude up. Just to give you a little context here, Twain wrote this in 1871 because Tweed's greed was apparent to all. He was a Tammany Hall politician in New York. In 1877, he was convicted of corruption and fraud, and Tweed is claimed to have stole as much as $200 million in 1877 dollars. That's more than $5 billion today. Can you imagine a politician stealing? Of course you can. Anyway, we live in a culture that is obsessed with money. And this, honestly, if I were to just shoot straight with you, is part of the reason and fear that I have in even coming to you to preach this message this morning. Because we live in a culture that is obsessed. You know, it used to be that there were two taboo subjects in American life: sex and money. And we will talk the mess about sex today. It's everywhere. We live in a hyper-sexualized culture. The only thing we're uncomfortable talking about anymore, let's tell the truth, is money. And I'll confess, I'm scared. I'm scared because I want to do so faithfully and honestly. You know, it's interesting to me in the text that Miss Joanne just read from 2 Corinthians chapter 8, the text that drives this message today. Paul is talking about money. By the way, Paul spends chapters 7, 8, and 9 in the letter that we call 2 Corinthians talking to the church in Corinth about collecting an offering that he wants to take to the poor folks in the church in Jerusalem. And he spends 3 full chapters talking to the Corinthians about this. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I'm terrified of, even though this is scripture, is part of the way he does this, because I really, honestly don't want to do this to you. I don't know if you heard him say it in that text that we just read, but just to put this in perspective, chapter 8, which opens like this. Paul says to the church in Corinth, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. The churches of Macedonia were 200 miles north of the church in Corinth. And Corinth was one of the most prosperous cities in the Roman Empire. It was a city of wealth. It was a New York, if you will, of its day. It was a city of power and prestige and tons of money flowing through it, tons of trade flowing through it. The churches and the cities of Macedonia, however, were relatively impoverished. They had been held and oppressed very violently by the Romans, and the people there didn't have a lot. So Paul is saying, hey, I want to tell you about the grace that's been granted to the churches up there in Macedonia. Next slide. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means, and even beyond their means. Do you see what he's doing? You see what he's doing? Man, that Swift Creek Baptist Church gives a lot of money. That Woodlake United Methodist Church seems to be doing all right down there in the street. What's going on, Chesterfield Baptist? Do you see what he's doing? He's laying it on thick. By the way, he's going to appeal, even in the text we read, back to this. I don't want to do that to you because, frankly, I do think you are incredibly generous. But the reality is, and the reality that I want to deal with and, frankly, get out of the way because I think Paul gets to some more important spiritual issues, is that we are a church, a Baptist church, and we operate and exist on your generosity. Plain and simple. More than 95% of the money we spend here comes through what you put in the offering plate or donate online. We only keep the lights on, keep the air moving, keep the building upright, make sure our staff are adequately compensated, that our ministries like children's ministry happen through your giving. That is simply the reality. And to give you a perspective of this, next slide, this is how our church roughly operates. And again, I want to get this off the table as quickly as possible. I want you to know this and move beyond, but I want you to know how important it is. Our church has a budget just a little over $387,000 for the current fiscal year that we operate on a January to December calendar here. Our staff are responsible for about 46% of that budget, as you'll see. The facility is another 26%. Then you'll see our missions and ministries each occupy about 10%, leaving the remaining 8% for things like insurance, office supplies, the administrative cost of running the church. When you give here, this is how your money is broken down. This is where it goes. And because we're a Baptist church, let me make sure you understand that there is no diocese or bishop or priest who dictates those percentages. You do. You have a say in how this money is spent. You have a voice in how we construct. We operate completely independently from any other organization. We compile and put this budget together every year in-house. We parse it out and how it's going to be spent in-house. You make this happen not just by what you give, but also by what you decide. And the more you participate here, the more you can help us shape that if you think any of those percentages are out of whack. We are a church that relies on your generosity. We have no parent organization. We have no other revenue streams that make sure that our doors stay open. You do. And I want to thank you for that because our church is doing incredible ministry. Our church is touching people, connecting with people, blessing people in ways that, frankly, any church with that relatively small sum of money compared to other amounts of money does in amazing ways. I think about what we're getting ready to do in Cape Charles, or our VBS and kids camp that just finished, or our homeless ministry, or our student ministry, or our children's ministry. You make it happen. And thank you for that. That being said, there is way more to why we give than just keeping the lights on in this place. There are two primary scriptural mandates for you to give. The first is, next slide, simple: worship. For time immemorial, people have given to God first and foremost as an act of worship. In fact, this, what we do here on every Sunday, is quite strange to the historic practice of God's people. You see, for thousands of years, the first and primary way that people worshiped God was by coming to a shrine, an altar in Jerusalem, and giving a gift. They called it a sacrifice. That's right. But it was something that cost them something. It was something material. Sure, there were songs and prayers in that temple. They opened the day and they closed the day. Worship, by the way, was a 7-day-a-week enterprise for the Jewish people. But if you wanted to go to Jerusalem as an average worshiper and worship the Lord, the way you did it was you picked the best of your sheep, or the best of your cows, or the best of your goats. Perhaps the best of your birds, if you were a little more on the lower income scale. And you brought them to Jerusalem carefully so that they would be preserved and unblemished, and offered them to God there. It was something that cost us something. And there was a recognition from the outset that it was a gift that we gave to God because God had gifted us so much. The language of worship starts with the language of gifts. And for most Americans, this makes us profoundly uncomfortable. We don't like gifts, do we? I mean, okay, if you're 8 and it's Christmas morning, sure. But think about it. Particularly, I think about the grown men in my family, my uncles and my cousins. Like, what do you even begin to get some of these rednecks for Christmas? Right? And what would they tell you? If I asked one of my uncles, what do you want for Christmas? Do you know what he would say to me? Anything I would want, I would buy the other 360. You've heard this, haven't you? Right? Gifts make us profoundly uncomfortable because we feel like we're in someone's debt, don't we? I don't think anything captures this better than one of my favorite television sitcoms, The Big Bang Theory. Take a look.
Okay, well, thank you for that, but I got you and Leonard a few silly neighbor gifts, so I'll just put them under my tree.
Wait, you bought me a present?
Uh-huh.
Well, why would you do such a thing?
I don't know, because it's Christmas?
Oh, Penny, I know you think you're being generous, but the foundation of gift giving is reciprocity. Like, you haven't given me a gift. You've given me an obligation.
Don't feel bad, Penny. It's a classic rookie mistake. My first Hanukkah with Sheldon, he yelled at me for 8 nights.
Honey, it's okay. You don't have to get me anything in return.
Of course I do. The essence of the custom is that I now have to go out and purchase for you a gift of commensurate value and representing the same perceived level of friendship as that represented by the gift you've given me. Well, it's no wonder suicide rates skyrocket this time of year.
Okay, you know what? Forget it. I'm not giving you a present.
No, it's too late. I see it. That elf sticker says to Sheldon. The die has been cast. The moving finger has writ. Hannibal has crossed the Alps.
I know it's funny when it's not happening to us.
Sheldon, I am very, very sorry.
No, I brought this on myself by being such an endearing and important part of your life. I'm going to need a ride to the mall.
It's happening to us.
Gift giving is obligation, isn't it? You know it, you felt it. I mean, again, it works great for kids on Christmas morning, but the reality is when we get gifts, we recognize that somebody has bestowed upon us grace, something we didn't deserve. And the earliest followers of this God recognized that the appropriate response to that, however small it might be, was to give something back. And so long before they started developing songs and instruments, long before they started developing complex prayers, worshipers approached God with an offering, with a gift. Because the primary goal of worship is thanksgiving. And what better way to do that than with a small portion, a gift, back to the great giver? King David said it like this. After he was trying to start an altar at a place, he wanted to use a threshing floor for this ceremony of worship. You can find this at the end of 2 Samuel 24, right at the end of the book, in fact. And the guy whose threshing floor he is going to use says, you can have it for free. And David says in response, I will not make an offering to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. Worship is gift giving, first and foremost. And by the way, this makes us so uncomfortable as Americans because we're independent. And our world gifts our obligations, and we're people who like to stand on our rights. Another word for that, by the way, are our entitlements. We get things not because they were an act of grace or a gift to us, but because they're our due. My question to you, and you're going to laugh at me when I say this, how many of you have ever thanked the federal government for your Social Security check? Because you paid into it, right? It's yours. It is literally an entitlement. It belongs to you. But the program itself was a gift to the American people that lifted millions of seniors out of destitute poverty. It was not something that had to exist. Now, certainly you have paid into it. And that is not a sermon on Social Security. But it is to recognize that most of our lives are, in fact, gifts. Worship is the recognition that I have been gifted, and maybe, just maybe, I owe a little something back. This is troubling for us because we are a society that is inundated with all sorts of discipleship. We wouldn't call it that, but marketing that trains us to think that we're in charge of our money. It belongs to us, and it belongs to us solely. And so Jesus, even in his own day, fought this and came with texts like this. Next slide. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You cannot serve God and mammon. There's a little bit of evidence for this, not a lot. But the word mammon is generally translated as wealth or money. And by the way, mammon may have been a foreign deity. It may have been another god in the ancient world. There's a little bit of evidence for that. Not enough to make a big deal of, but let me make sure you understand this. If it is a foreign god, then it is the only foreign god named in the New Testament. Of all of the idols that Jesus could have named, he picked the one that had to do with money and wealth. And the recognition that there are things which capture our minds and hearts, things to which we belong and give ourselves. And whether we recognize it or not, what we slave for and work for and serve are the very things that we worship. And worship is rightly due only to the God of Israel. And thus, even in his own day, in the first century, amongst people who were incredibly poor, he recognized that our hearts can be swayed away from true worship by pursuing money. and this notion of gift giving and where our hearts is and obligation, and I know it makes us uncomfortable. The reality is our worship flows from this. And so I'd like to share with you a quote from the deceased poet, Maya Angelou, who used to tell students at Wake Forest and Duke University when they entered for their freshman years this: "You have been the beneficiaries of the best that this society has to offer. We have given you the best education we know how to give. In other words, we have given you something. You have already received a gift. We have told you all that we know. Now you owe us something." And then she would quote Jesus to these incoming freshmen: "To the one to whom much is given, much will be required." The first reason we give materially, something that does not cost me nothing, but something that demonstrates where my heart belongs, is worship. Giving is an act of worship. Do you see it that way? And let me be clear for a second. I don't mean in the offering plates we pass. Certainly, I think we're a worthy institution to give through. But here's the reality. Your giving is first and foremost, maybe only, between you and God, no matter where you give. Is it an act of worship for you? Is it an act of thanksgiving and joy and recognizing that my heart belongs to that one? And whether I give it to the Salvation Army, or I give it to Mercy Mall, or I give it to Chesterfield Baptist, it is an act of thanksgiving to the one true God. The second reason that we give, next slide, Mr. Chip, is that. Plain and simple. We give first and foremost because of our vertical relationship with God, but the reality is, as we heard Miss Joanne read in the text that Paul writes to the Corinthians, the reality is there are a lot of folks out there in need. And some of us, God has blessed. And he has blessed us not for us to enjoy it, but that blessing, like that glass Miss Sharon had, would overflow us and pour into those around us. Now, this is where I'm probably going to step on a few toes, because we in America are taught that it is ours. In fact, we're taught things like what the church should get is a tithe, which is what? 10%. I'll never forget years ago when I was in seminary, my seminary professor was a guy named, one of my professors was a guy named Dr. Cecil Sherman, who pastored the First Baptist Church in Asheville, North Carolina. And I love this story. Maybe I've told it here before. I couldn't find that I had. But if I have and you're listening to it again, you need to hear it like 8 times, not just twice. Anyway, Dr. Sherman told a story at First Baptist Asheville. You see, back in the 70s, churches used to pledge their budget every year. Some of you probably been a part of a church that pledged its budget, right? In other words, the church would collect pledges in August and September and build what people were planning to give, build the budget off of what people said that they were going to give for the upcoming year. Yes? Well, in the 70s, churches started moving away from that. They started saying, hey, people gave this year, this year. We can expect them to give this year. We're going to build the budget on that anticipated figure, not on the pledges. And Dr. Sherman was adamantly opposed against this. He said, this is crazy. He said, we're missing an opportunity to discipleship. So in one of his business meetings, he said, let's table this for a month. We'll come back in a month and we'll make a decision on it. And so Dr. Sherman went away to the local social services department in Asheville, North Carolina. And he asked at that time what the average welfare check was for a family in Asheville, North Carolina. He got the number, he ran the figures, and he came back to that next meeting. And he looked at his congregation and he said, folks, if our congregation tithed, gave 10% of an average welfare check, our budget would go up 250%, 2.5 times. By the way, I ran some numbers here. We're a little bit of a senior congregation, so let's talk Social Security again. The average Social Security check in America right now is $1,780 a month. We run about $150 on a Sunday, so I ran the numbers. If you were to tithe a Social Security check, and can we all agree an average Social Security check ain't a lot of money? Like you ain't eating lobster and steak on a Social Security check. Can we agree on that? It's going to be a lot of Vienna sausage and some saltines, ain't it? Right? If our church, 150 people, were to tithe a Social Security check, we would come in just a little under our budgeted amount. In other words, if our church tithed the Social Security check, we would almost make budget. Can't we agree that that's not a ton of money? It's just the world in which we live. But here's the issue, and here's where you may take issue with me. Tithing is not the biblical standard. That's right, I said it. In fact, in the Old Testament, there are 3 different tithes prescribed to the people of Israel. 2 of the tithes, 10%, were to be given every year. The third tithe, 10%, was to be given every 3 years, which means the Old Testament standard was 23.3% every year. What's the New Testament example? Well, the scriptures make it unambiguously clear. Next slide. The early church in Acts 2 is described in this way. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any who had need. First and foremost, recognize that giving is about generosity and it's about meeting needs. But do you see what the people say belong to the church? Everything. 2 chapters later, the church is described like this. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any property or possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. And as a consequence of that, there was not a needy person among them. For as many as had or owned lands or houses sold them and brought them to the proceeds of what was sold. Let me be clear again. What drives giving in the church are needs. And where we see needs, the church doesn't go back on a 10%. The church recognizes that God in my abundance has given me that which my brother or sister might need. Or as Paul is going to say in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, as we just read, your presence abundant, it is a question of a fair balance or equality, if you remember the text, between your presence abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. By the way, Paul is quoting there the people who got manna in Exodus 16. He's saying this is not even a new teaching. What I'm teaching you now about equality and fairness, about your abundance supplying their need, my abundance supplying your need, and vice versa, goes all the way back to when God first liberated the people. Do you remember what happened to the people who gathered too much manna when they went out, when they tried to hoard it? It rotted and was eaten up by worms. In other words, your abundance is not for you. It is meant to bring blessing. It is meant to gift and service the needs of others. We give because we love God, because our heart is connected to Him, but we give because the world is not fair. And Paul in the scriptures from start to finish proclaim to us that it is our job to offer them who are in need what we have. And by the way, this was not something that was lost on the church fathers of yore. For 2,000 years, the church has been proclaiming this, and pastors and priests and bishops have been fired because of it, because it's a hard teaching. But let me show you what a couple of them have said. Skip down to St. Ambrose. St. Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century said this: "You rich, how far will you push your frenzied greed? When giving to the poor, you are not giving him what is yours. Rather, you are paying him back what is already his." Keep going, Chip. indeed what is common to all and what has been given to all of us to make use of. In other words, the resources God has bestowed, you have usurped or hoarded for yourselves alone. Next slide. The earth belongs to all, and not only to the rich. You therefore are paying back your debt. You are not giving gratuitously what you do not owe. That's a hard thing to say in a church. He says the rich are stealing from the poor. It's not theirs. But he wasn't alone. 100 years later, St. Jerome said it like this: for all riches proceed from injustice. Can you imagine standing in front of a group of people? Can you understand why my knees might be shaking this morning? For all riches proceed from injustice, and unless one has lost, the other cannot find. So this proverb seems to me most true. Either a rich man is unjust, or he inherited it from an unjust man. We give for two reasons. Because we love God, and because we love people. I feel like Jesus said this somewhere. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your might. And the second is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Obviously, I want you to give to Chesterfield Baptist, but hear me say this, brothers and sisters. Frankly, God could care less. It's not about us. It's never been about us in this brick and mortar place. It's about what he is doing in the world. What God wants is for you to give. He wants you to worship him, and he wants you to be generous. And by the way, everything in Scripture says when you do one, you do the other. When you worship God, when you're a lover of this God, when your treasure, your heart is pointed towards him, your material treasure is going to be pointed to others. And the Scriptures want to proclaim, when you give to your brother in need, you are truly worshiping your God. It's not two different things. It's two sides of the same coin. So we're going to do something else we've never done before. We're going to take the offering after my sermon. Why do you give? Now, by the way, my team told me, this is a really stupid idea, Sammy. It's the 5th Sunday in the month. Like, nobody has money to give on June 30th. And that's okay. Because it's not about what you put in these plates. It's about where your heart is oriented to this God. And it's about your brothers and sisters in need that you serve. I pray that as a part of this community and in your own individual walks, in your own life with God and Jesus, you will understand, that you will embrace, and that you will be a worshipful person, not just in word, in song, in prayer here on a Sunday morning, but with the very things God has gifted you with. May they be gifts to others. We're going to collect the offering this morning from back to front. Our ushers are already in the back. But before we do that, would you pray with me? Father, we trust ourselves to you, and we recognize the goodness, the blessings, the gifts you have bestowed upon us. And so now, as we as a people come to truly worship, may we offer our gifts to you. May our relationship with you not be cheap grace, but costly grace. May we recognize that life with you does indeed cost us something, just as what you have done for us cost you everything. And Father, whatever it is we give to, whether it be in these plates or whether it be in the world around us. May it bless and serve and bring equality. May abundance from us flow into those who need it, that there would indeed be a fair balance, as your Apostle Paul called for. Help us to be a people who serve the poor, the needy, the marginalized, the forgotten. Help us to be a people who recognize that you have not blessed us for us, but that so we may be a blessing to others. In the name of your Son, Jesus, who came offering blessing to us, we come to you now. Amen. Ushers.